Hello and welcome to week 10 of American Literature. If you're watching this today, happy Halloween! We'll be looking at two different authors this week. The first is one of America's most beloved poets, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. After you watch this lecture, I'd like you to read the biography on him and then read the two poems, A Psalm of Life and The Day is Done. For each of these poems, I'd like you to read the poem aloud to yourself, and then I'd like you to watch these two videos of someone reading the poem to you as well. Poems are things that you need to read several times in order to understand them. The second author is another beloved American author, Edgar Allan Poe. Hopefully you've read him before. There's an extensive biography on him in the Norton Anthology of American Literature, found on pages 604 to 608. Please read that entirely. Then I'd like you to read The Raven, found on pages 612 to 615. You can also watch these two different video interpretations of the poem. I'd also like you to read the poem Annabel Lee, found on 618 to 619, and then two of his shorter stories, The Cask of Amontillado, 696 to 701, and The Telltale Heart, 666 to 670. Then I'd like you to participate in this week's discussion forum. So let's start off by talking a little bit about Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He was born in 1803 in Portland, Maine, second of 8 children, and he died in 1882. He lived a very long time for someone during his generation. He was the most beloved poet of the 19th century. He outsold England's poet laureate Alfred Lord Tennyson. And he worked in established forms. All of his poems are show a real metrical complexity. That's why reading them aloud is so important. You can hear the different ways that he's using metrics in his poem. He was a Smith Professor of Modern Languages at Harvard until he was able to stop teaching because he was making so much money off of his poems. Now, that is not the case in modern America. Poets do not get to retire because they're bestsellers. A couple of generations ago, the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's reputation and popular audience were so robust that there could be no need to introduce him to an American or British roomful of marginally literate young people. I mean, you could go anywhere and everyone would know Longfellow. In fact, my grandmother, who only got a 7th grade education, could recite Longfellow to her dying days because he was taught in the schools and everyone memorized his poems. In his lifetime, his work, he was called, in America, he was called a fireside poet. He was known as the fireside poet, and there were several poets that were also associated with that phrase. And it was a compliment then. It was a phrase that acknowledged his extraordinary stature as a living American bard. And people would literally gather around their fireplaces to read his work aloud. His Brattle Street home in Cambridge, Massachusetts, near Harvard, was a place that tourists would come to see, like the home of a Hollywood celebrity. And at the turn of the 20th century, busts of Longfellow were standard front hall decor in college and Carnegie libraries. Longfellow was proficient in several languages, and he was a skilled translator of Dante and many German lyrics. He was a true scholar as well as a world-famous artist. And with his strong, regular features and grand beard, he also looked the part. He really looks like a poetic figure, kind of the way Robert Frost looks like a poetic figure. By the second decade of the 20th century, with the rise of English departments that had a special stake in obscurity, the fireside poets, so poets like Longfellow, he became unpopular. A poet who tried to write for everyone and who succeeded didn't leave room for the invention of scholastics. No one had to pick apart Longfellow's poems. Anyone could pick up his poems and read it. So there was little work for the English department to do. He understood the value of poetry as an utterance overheard, as a quarrel with the self. Longfellow observes in ways that suggest several blended identities. He's solitary at the same time that he's like an ambassador. The poems you're going to be reading are A Psalm of Life and The Day is Done. And I do really want to emphasize that I would like you to read them aloud to yourself, take notes, but also listen to other people reading them aloud to you. Now, Edgar Allan Poe is the next person we're going to be studying. He was born in 1809 and died in Baltimore in 1849. There is a biography in our book. I'd like you to read the whole thing because there's a lot of myths about Poe, and I'd like you to watch a short video on PBS that's about all the myths about him. It's pretty good. It's kind of like a myth buster. He's a poet that was, so after he died, he was forgotten for many years by the American canon, although he was very popular during his lifetime, the end of his lifetime. So for 3 decades, nobody read Poe, and then he was rediscovered and venerated by the symbolist and imagist poets in France in the late 1800s and early 1900s. His work is important. He's known as an imaginative writer of real consequence, rather than merely as a maestro of Gothic entertainments or a poet who writes and show off romantic verse. So when you read Poe, you can read him just on the surface level, or you can read him in a much deeper way. Why do you think Poe has become so influential in our popular culture? Most of you have probably been exposed at least to The Telltale Heart or The Raven, or, I mean, you can see references to The Raven on so many popular TV shows, and he's really a forebearer of mountains of Gothic novels, of slash and hack films, and gruesome television shows. So why do you think that is? And when I say Gothic, I mean like creepy mansions and, you know, things like that. Poe has changed for us, and he has changed us. The largest and most vexing questions might be how we should take him seriously, and what our efforts to do so say about our notions of seriousness in imaginative literature. The unconscious and the world of dreams and the drift into sleep, which is a reoccurring theme we've seen in American literature this semester, informs Poe's work in poems and stories such as The Raven and The City in the Sea, and many of the short stories including Ligeia and The Fall of the House of Usher. The poems and stories that you'll be reading for this class are The Raven, found on pages 612 to 615. You'll also be watching these 2 different videos on it. Annabel Lee, short poem, The Cask, and please read it aloud, The Cask of Amontillado, and The Telltale Heart. So for this week's discussion, I would like you to introduce a poem or story to the rest of the group. You're going to choose one of the poems by Longfellow, or one of the stories or poems by Poe that were not assigned to you, so not the ones that were listed above. I want you to read it closely and to introduce it to the class via discussion post. You may not repeat stories or poems, so you need to look at the discussion forum first, see which stories and poems have been done, and then read and post your own. Please include the following information about the story or poem that you're writing about. Give the title and author and the date that it was first published. You may have to do a little research on this. I want you to summarize the poem or story. What happens? What's it about? Tell me who the main character or protagonist of the story is, if it's a short story, or who is the speaker of the poem. Whose story is being told? What does the character desire more than anything else? What stands in the way of that character's achievement of his or her life goal? Who is telling the story? Is it the main character, or is it someone else observing this person? Where does the story, poem, play take place? Sorry, no play. Is it a real place? Are there images that stick out as being important? And if so, what are they? And why are they important? Then I'd like you to relate this story or poem to the rest of the work by this author that you're aware of. Why is the story or poem important? What does it tell us about American literature? After you've posted your own post, I would like for you to also respond to 3 posts by your peers. All right, that's it for this week, guys. I look forward to seeing you online. Good job with your work last week.